the final Story City training video, tips for the Adventurous editor / feedback provider. So whether you are an official Story City community mentor or you just want to contribute to the community by helping out your fellow creatives, providing feedback and helping all of us get better at creating these kind of adventures, this video is for you. So some of this information you may have already heard before in other videos, but I decided that I would put it all in one video so that it was kind of in one handy dandy spot to help remind you when you needed to check in on some general tips and guidelines that we provide based on our experience over the past 5 years with Story City. So let's jump right into it. First one is character tips. So number one, if a particular story is fantastical, you may need to note the character's reaction. So we don't want to usurp the reader's response at all, obviously, but there must be some sort of acknowledgement that something has happened that is out of the ordinary. Because even when we're stepping into a character's shoes, we still have to indicate to people in subtle ways that something has essentially changed and they need to take note of the fact that this is weird and this is part of the things that they should care about in the story. The next one is that when you're making an immersive narrative where you want the audience to interact and take part in the narrative, you need to make sure that they are neutral in terms of gender, race, or age. Because if you are putting someone into the shoes of another person, anything that doesn't match who they are can throw them out of the story. In saying that, if you like, you can assign a character to a person, but just realize that some people may not be as comfortable or immersed if they're not standing in the shoes of someone that's like that. And that, in fact, may actually be your intention. But we just wanted to let you know that there are pros and cons in doing it in different ways. So obviously if there's a project where the point of it is to learn about another culture or another person's experience and to literally put people in somebody else's shoes, then yes, assigning someone a character can be incredibly helpful. But generally in most Story City projects, we have aimed for neutrality because there is nothing more annoying when if you are not a white heterosexual male being constantly forced to take upon a character who is that when there are so many people of different races, ages, genders, who also want to feel like they're literally a part of the story. So as I said, we aim for neutrality, but of course, whatever other characters that are in the story that your reader basically interacts with can be whatever race, age, gender you would like them to be. The next section that I kind of wanted to talk about is backstory. So we try not to put too much character backstory into an adventure. Number one, it tends to make the adventure too long as a start, and when people are signing up to do a fictional adventure in particular, they're wanting to get straight into the action to know why it is that they should continue walking through this city and expending a little bit more extra effort than they would if they were sitting at home with a book. But also, if an audience member is an only child and they don't have a brother and you put a brother in the story of your character, then that can sometimes break the believability for that person. So for that reason, what we tend to suggest is you assign them friends or people that you would normally look up to, like a teacher, for example, because they're better companions for this type of immersive experience that doesn't throw a reader out. Again, going back to the previous point, if you are wanting to expose people to a particular narrative where you want them to feel uncomfortable being in that person's shoes or to truly understand what it feels like to be in that person's shoes, then obviously that will also change the backstory component. But again, the pros and cons, just so that you guys know what to expect and that it can change your audience size or your market for your story as a result of that. Then we have things like particular themes or storylines that might not work as you intended it to if anybody can step into the story. So the example that I like to give is a love story which might end up as an unintentional queer love story where that wasn't your intention. I frankly would love a story like that where anybody could potentially step into that role, and so I could get to experience the universality that is love from a different pairing perspective. To me, that's really exciting. But again, it's one of those things where, what is your intention? Are you happy for that to happen? Those kind of things. And not only with gender as well, but you might want to be careful with the fact that, say, you know, what happens if someone who is a minor or a child steps into your story that has like really graphic details, if it's like a war story, for example. So all of those things are just some of the things to be aware of when including your story, rating your story, those kind of things. The final thing in the character tips is that the participant and reader needs to play an active role in the story. They can't just be a bystander watching on. They need to be a part of the action. Why else would you do a choose your own adventure if you were still just passively watching and people were telling you things? While that's a really easy thing for you as a writer to do because you don't have to think of how to build that interactivity in, it makes a very poor experience for the participant as a whole. So they need to contribute significantly to the solution or the failed attempt in a story. So we want people to be active parts of this tale. Because as we said, we want to redefine stories so that there's something that you're a part of rather than something you're told. It's one of our main missions here at Story City. And so hopefully this helps you navigate things like choices as well as things like motivations for your characters and action in your multiple ending scenes if you're doing a choose your own adventure. Now, all of these tips are obviously for fictional based stories. The suggestions for things related to technology come a little bit later in this video for those of you who are having a look at things like walking tours and non-fiction self-guided tours as part of what it is you're trying to write or give feedback on. So that then leads me into what we like to call choice architecture. So how do you make your choices in your choose your own adventure stories so that they are really compelling to a reader? So here are some of our tips based on that. So be wary of endings that are boring or peter out, because choose your own adventures tend to have these very dramatic endings. They tend to work a bit better. And the reason behind that is because a person is only going to visit maybe 4 of the locations out of the 15 that you have to write. So while you might be getting a little bit of brain fatigue trying to figure out 8 exciting and fun endings, remember that your participant may only ever see 4 or 5 of those locations. So to them, it is the whole story. And if you have a boring location at the end, then they're going to give you a different review than perhaps somebody who ends up with a much more exciting ending. So something to consider. Another thing that I did just want to say is that you 100% have our permission to kill characters or the participant's character off in different endings. The great thing about this format is that you don't always have to have a happy ending, right? So you can go for the tragedies on one path and then you have the happy ending on the other path and the like somebody is maimed in the middle pathway, right? So there are no rules about not killing characters off at all. So don't feel like you have to pull back if you don't want to. The other thing that is really great about Choose Your Own Adventures is that you can theme different pathways of your story. So say you had 5 different branches of your choose your own adventure. You could have one theme that's sci-fi, another one that's fantasy, the next one that's private investigator, another one might be crime. And you can even not only play around with the different themes in the different branches, so you can play around with the different genres, but you can also play around with the characters as well. How do those characters react in those different genres? Or maybe down one pathway your main character is good and in the other pathway they are a villain. So you get to play around and experiment with those kind of things, where not like the publishing industry where, you know, you must do science fiction and you must do love stories and you must do crime because like there are very distinct markets. This is a new format, right? And if you want to play around with mixing and matching genres because it makes a good story, then go for it. Experiment, have fun, try different things out in different branches. And then with the analytics in the Story City app, you'll be able to tell what interests people, right? And then from there, you can hone your stories and your storyteller skills and meet the audiences that love you in fun and interesting places. So as mentioned previously, you need to make sure that each choice that you give a person in a location, so it might be 2 choices, 3 choices, whatever, is motivationally based. So we have had previous instances where a writer has essentially dared a reader down one pathway, so it's not really a choice at all. It voids the idea of choice when you do that kind of thing. So each choice needs to be equally compelling, and it is not motivational to a person who is taking part in a choose your own adventure to make the choices based on location. Because if they're from out of town, they may have never seen that location, they may not know its significance or things like how far away it is. And so as a result, they're not going to be invested in the story if you're just giving them spots to pick from. They want to be a part of the story, which means that you need to base your choices on motivation. So the motivation might be, do you decide to follow the girl because she shouldn't be alone during a zombie apocalypse and you don't want to leave her in the streets? Or do you kick the girl to the curb because you believe that she's being too fidgety and she might already be infected with the zombies virus, right? And so like those types of things are motivationally or story-based rather than do you follow the girl to thing B or do you tell the girl, see you later, I'm going to thing C, right? Like it doesn't have the same weight as the motivational based choices has. The other thing to really make sure that you do is not to repeat scenes in different branches. So yes, the majority of people are only going to see one branch in a story, but also remember that there is such intense curiosity of what if I chose differently. We think about that all the time in life, where we have regrets of what if I had chosen differently, what would have happened. In this scenario, they can literally go back and see what would have happened if they had chosen something else. And if they find out that you've essentially done the same story, just in different locations, and that their choices didn't actually make a difference, they're going to be very unhappy with you, because again, you have built that reader trust up, saying that you are given these choices and these choices matter, and the reader trusts you that these choices matter. And then when you break that trust, it ends up souring the experience for the participant. And just in case you're thinking, well, Emily, come on, like how many people actually go back and redo a choice? Our statistics say that 30% of all participants for a story will go back and redo different branches just to see what happened, right? So that's 1/3 of your potential audience will actually go back and do the story again at another time to see what happened. So you want to make sure that you are being respectful to your reader, and though it does take a little bit more thought on your part and a little bit more storyboarding and outlining, use the locations as your inspiration, right? What could happen here? What could change things? What can make things different? How can you introduce new and exciting characters into the plot? Can you change up the genre? Again, all of these different kind of things allow you to play with stories in a way that you could never do when you were writing a linear story. And I promise, the more of these that you write, the better at this you will get. Finally, if you wish to do things in a way that gaming books used to do in the past, so essentially providing a list of things that people can bring with them on their adventure, then please feel free to do so. So I know in old gaming books they were like, here is a list of 12 things, you may pick 3 things to bring on your adventure with you. So if you happen to have that item, when a choice needs to be made, then that will change the outcome of a story. So we haven't actually had anyone do that in our adventures yet, so I'll be really keen to see someone try that out. But also be considerate of the participant. It's going to really make their day if the items that you are listing in your list are actually things that they have. So while things like, you know, an axe and a sword and a Viking helmet and all of those things sound really fun, does your participant actually have access to those things, and can they bring it on the tour with them to be able to take photographs and share that on social media and have people being like, hey, what are you doing with this random thing in the middle of an everyday street, right? Like you get to, those kind of questions get asked when people actually have access to those props. So maybe you might want to make these props something that's really easy to find around the house, like a spatula and a broom or something like that. Or if you are aiming your story at people who are hardcore LARPers, so like live action role players, or people who really like zombie walks or whatever, you can get a bit more creative with the things. So maybe mix your list up a bit. I would be really keen to see some of those adventures come through. Next on our handy dandy tip video is the plot tips. Now, one of the main things that we get at Story City is pitches for time travel stories, which is great, but can be problematic when you're doing locative based experiences because things are very clearly different from how you were trying to describe them. So if you wanted to set a story in post-apocalyptic city of your choice, but as the person is walking around the streets, those streets are perfectly intact, it breaks the reality and believability of the imagined world that you're trying to set up. So unlike books or movies where people can really immerse themselves, even in VR, they're completely surrounded by a virtual environment, whereas this is merging something very, very real with fiction. And so the problem with time travel is that you need to show people moving back or forward in time, and that there has to be some remnants of that history or the supposed future in that location. Otherwise, these stories just don't work. I'm always willing to be proven wrong, but that has been our experience so far. There also needs to be some sort of journey or mission or task for the participant who is taking part in the experience to undertake over the course of the story. Because they are an active participant in fictional adventures, the plotline must allow for some sort of seeking. Now, obviously, if you are doing a walking tour, which is historical or food-based or those kind of things, then that kind of doesn't apply. And similarly, if you're doing a performance-based thing, which might be a theatre or a dance or a circus-based, for example, or a documentary, people may not need to be an active participant in those. But in fictional puzzle trails, choose your adventures, interactive film, where you are essentially a character in the story, there needs to be some sort of point to the story. So generally some sort of journey or seeking, like in any story you would find in a novel or in a movie, is what we're after. Then you also need to note at least 1 or 2 features of the location in every scene. So because the reader is standing in the location, you don't need large tracts of description because they're already there. It's not like a novel, but you do need to highlight 1 or 2 special features in each location to build that reader trust and to ground the fiction in that specific location. It also allows you to point out those interesting features that people may not have bothered to take notice of before. Remember that people's attention span in this type of experience can be very short. So don't make each destination too long. 500 to 700 words for each location is perfect because it gives you an audio of at least under 5 minutes. Obviously, if you're doing walking tour, people will generally sustain anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes with walking tour locations, but if you're doing one of those interactive, fictional-based adventures, you don't want to keep people in one location for too long because essentially they are standing there as part of their participation. Also, no placeholder scenes allowed. So because the Choose Your Own Adventure stories are so short, you must make sure that something happens in every scene because people are only visiting 4 or 5 locations out of the 15 that you have put together. There is no room for scenes or locations that don't have a point to the overall quest or mission of a story. You don't need to make things that happen either as broad as to encompass every reader. That's kind of our final plot point in the plot tip section. As a writer, rather than trying to make sure that you encompass everybody's experience. So I had one writer once say that a phone buzzed, tweaked, vibrated, and whirred. You could just pick one word. Like those sorts of things don't matter. You don't need to encompass all possibilities for something that small. Finally, reducing locations. Sometimes when we are providing feedback or editing a writer's work in the interactive story gaming realm, we get handed this mess of scenes. Now, the problem with that is that when you're working in a collaboration, that means if you have exploded your project from 15 scenes to 20, then all of a sudden the artist, the musician, the narrator have to do a bunch more work than they maybe were originally contracted to do. Also, when you get those mess of stories, generally there tends to be a lot of repetition and bunches of scenes that are a bit boring. So these are my recommendations for reducing the locations and making a tighter narrative. First, I suggest you merge if 2 scenes in different branches of the story are essentially doing the same things in terms of theme, antagonist, or challenges. So when you get 2 scenes that are like that, they're generally candidates for a merge. So you pick the most interesting location out of the 2, and then you take the unique things from each section and kind of merge them into a new super location instead. Any scenes that are in the same location, where one scene is stronger than another scene, or if the locations are too close together and you need to choose one and discard the other for the app to work properly, those are also candidates for merging. If you have a location that makes the walk from start to end too long, and we recommend a minimum of about, as I said, a kilometre maximum, maybe 1.5 kilometres for Choose Your Own Adventures. For walking tours, you might get away with 2.5 kilometres, but that would be at the very max. If that location and the walk from start to end is too long, you may want to delete a location that is too far away or merge it with another one. Any scenes that have unsatisfying endings in comparison to others, I normally automatically delete. Scenes that don't have much happening or don't move the narrative forward with some sort of defining event or choice for that location, or at least if I don't delete those, I will get people to rewrite them so that they have more of a punch emotionally. Other scenes that I will delete are scenes where it was all a dream, because that ending is never satisfying, even in a Choose Your Own Adventure. And finally, the final thing that I would look into deleting is if a section is fun and atmospheric, but ultimately doesn't add anything to the overall adventure. So I hope you enjoyed this video series. I hope you learnt a lot about how we make locative adventures and how potentially you could play around with the format. All of the tips and tricks in these videos are guidelines. We run Story City for about 5 years, and these are the learnings that we have. Take on board what makes sense to you, experiment with other things, and as I said, I am always willing to be proven wrong. Feel free to email me if you have made a killer narration out of something that I said would never work, and you've got many people lining up to do it. I am always eager and keen to have people show me that they've met my challenges. So thank you so much for joining us for this training series. I hope that you make many amazing things together, and I hope that you have many adventures.